Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Around the Empire is listener-supported independent media. Pitch in if you can at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. Our guest today is Shireen Al-Adeimi. We discuss the recent attacks on the Saudi oil facilities, the battle in Najran near the Saudi-Yemen border. Shireen then lays out some history on the wars in recent decades in Yemen, both civil wars and foreign interventions. And she offers some important insights on how the Saudi-United Arab Emirates coalition, backed by the US and other Western powers, doesn't even have a coherent objective anymore. Further, the Saudis and the Emiratis are fighting against each other in a proxy war. Lastly, we talk about Samantha Power's new memoir, in which she omits any mention of the war in Yemen or her role in the Obama administration's decision to support and sustain it. Shireen Al-Adeimi is an assistant professor of education at Michigan State University. Having lived through 2 civil wars in her country of birth, Yemen, she's played an active role in raising awareness about the U.S.-supported Saudi-led war on Yemen since 2015. Through her work, she aims to encourage political action among fellow Americans to bring about an end to the U.S. intervention in Yemen. We recorded this on October 3rd, 2019. And I need to add an apology here to Shireen and to the listeners for the long delay in publishing this interview. I have had some intermittent problems with my recording equipment, and it took some doing to get this back into shape, some glitches and other problems. So I hope to work that out with some investment in some new equipment. And again, my apologies. However, I think the interview is still very fresh and relevant, and I hope you enjoy it. Thanks. Shireen Al-Adeimi is here speaking to us from Michigan. It's great to meet you, Shireen. Thanks so much for coming on to the show. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Shireen, please tell us a little bit about yourself since the audience is just meeting you for the first time.
So I am currently an assistant professor at Michigan State University. I research language and literacy and classroom practices that improve learning for students. And I was born in Yemen. I grew up in Yemen, and kind of got involved in anti-war activism over the last 4.5 years or so.
Great, thanks. So there are 3 topics that we'd like to cover today. First, I'd like to get your thoughts and information on the recent attacks on Saudi Arabian oil facilities and the big operation near the Saudi-Yemen border announced by the Houthis last weekend. And then we're going to talk about 2 of Shireen's recent articles at inthesetimes.com on the conflicting goals of the Saudi-UAE coalition in Yemen. And the second article and our third topic is Shireen's opinion piece about Samantha Power's recent memoir, where she fails to even mention her role in this war in Yemen, which is outrageous in itself. But, I also want to ask you, Shireen, I'm not sure which title I should be using for the Houthis. Is it Ansar Allah or the Houthis? I don't want to use a derogative term, but everyone seems to refer to them by the name Houthis, but I've heard other people say, no, you should say Ansar Allah.
Right. So Ansar Allah is what they refer to themselves. And Houthi is kind of an incomplete statement, I would say. Not derogatory necessarily, but incomplete because it reflects it's a family last name, the last name of the family who initially started preaching against President Saleh at the time in the 90s and into the 2000s. And so the current leader of the Houthis is Abdul Malik al-Houthi. So it's, kind of using their last name to go to refer to the movement. The movement itself is called Ansarullah.
Ansarullah, so I should transition.
Even when I write, I use Houthis frequently because that's what most people are familiar with.
Yeah. I mean, we have enough trouble sort of getting enough people to understand what's going on. And
right.
So, yeah, but I think I will try to Ansar Allah, right?
Hmm.
Ansar Allah. I don't want to say it wrong either because, Um, okay, so let's start with the recent attacks on Saudi Arabia at the oil facilities. And of course, leading up to that, a progression of retaliatory attacks by the Ansar Allah movement. And of course, this last one is the one that got everyone's attention. And I know that there have been some retaliatory attacks from, the Saudis started bombing again. I know there were attempts at truces and ceasefires, but I don't really know exactly what happened. I wonder if you could offer us, what you know on that. Any insights would be appreciated.
Right. So the Houthis have been, the one area that they've focused on since the beginning of the war, because they don't have an air force and don't have the kinds of weapons that the Saudis are using in Yemen. They have a lot of ground troops, and because Yemen shares the border with Saudi Arabia, they've been, kind of attacking at the ground level. But none of these operations have really been significant in any way over the last several years until this last event, which they're claiming have managed to capture. They're saying thousands of prisoners who are mostly Yemenis working on behalf of the Saudi-led coalition, and they're showing footage of captured vehicles, many light armored vehicles that were sold by Canada to the Saudis have been captured and damaged by the Houthis. And so they're, if none of this has been independently confirmed, but they do have video evidence of much of what they're saying. So it does seem to have caught people's attention. And the Saudis have not responded to it, but it seems to be maybe possibly a turning point whereby the Saudis may actually view the Houthis as being capable to at least inflict some kind of harm. And this, of course, is following the September 14th attack on Saudi oil fields in Aramco, which the Houthis claimed, but Saudi Arabia blamed Iran for. And those attacks ended up disabling the Saudi oil production, 54% of it, for a short time. And so it seems to have also, they seem to have also managed to caught Saudi by surprise in those last couple of attacks.
Right. And now, do you find I find the claims by the Houthis credible from what I've seen from, and really kind of from people I've heard talk about it. Yeah, they have a history of being truthful and accurate, so I have no reason to doubt them now. What do you think? Do you overall find those claims credible or not?
It would be difficult to make it up, especially the September 14th attacks on Aramco. I think it would be highly embarrassing for the Saudis as well to admit that this was in fact carried out by the Houthis, and so they're trying to deflect the blame on Iran, as they have been throughout this war, because it makes more sense to say that an equal, a power that's equally capable of inflicting harm would, but then that would mean that somehow Iranians were able to go over the American U.S. Navy bases in the Strait of Hormuz to launch missiles at Saudi Arabia, which is inconceivable. But it is likely that the Houthis were able to send that from Yemen and the Saudi defense system to have failed, air defense systems to have failed. But the latest attacks in Najran, they seem to have occurred as well, but I just am not sure about the numbers. They're saying they've captured thousands of people. I'm not sure that if that is completely accurate or if there's some exaggeration, but whatever the case, they have been able to inflict some harm on Saudi Arabia's military, not civilians, of course. But Saudi Arabia retaliates by bombing Yemeni civilians, so that's also unfortunate and criminal.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, the Saudis have also reached out for talks. True. I mean, it's hard to sort out what's true and what's not in the media because there's so much um, inaccurate information.
Mm-hmm.
But why would the Saudis reach out to do talks or any kind of a truce if it was Iran? Why would they reach out to people in Yemen?
Right, and I'm not sure again about that report. It was reported by the Wall Street Journal, who the author of those pieces seems to have been relying on anonymous Saudi officials for various claims, some of which make sense and others don't. But they're fighting the Houthis, they're fighting Yemenis, they're not fighting Iran. They've never been fighting Iran and Yemen. That's just been a narrative that unfortunately many in Western media have been very uncritical about and have been repeating. But there's no evidence that Iran is supporting the Houthis in any significant way outside of support in the media and kind of an advisory capacity. But the narrative that Saudi is fighting Iran and Yemen has been completely false.
Right. And are you hearing anything from home, from people at home who, you know, what are you hearing? Anything of interest?
Related to Iran's involvement, or?
Yeah, the latest, related to the latest operations.
I mean, people are tired of war.
Yeah.
People are
Yeah.
tired of not having enough food and not having electricity and not knowing if they're going to survive the next day, and not knowing if they're going to be able to afford basic things like medicine. And the Houthis have many supporters, but I don't think that the entire country is united with them. So there's of course a lot of dissidents in the country as well. But I think no matter where people fall in the spectrum, they're just tired of war and tired of this silence from the international community that is seen as giving permission to the Saudis to continue to operate in Yemen with impunity.
Yeah, yeah, I can imagine. Well, I can't really imagine. I've never lived in a war-torn country, and especially not one that's, the greatest humanitarian crisis on the planet.
Yeah.
And this is a good, I think, transition into your article about, it's titled, for people who haven't read it yet, it's in these times, and there'll be a link to it in the show notes. It's titled "The U.S.-Backed Coalition Can't Agree on Why It's Bombing Yemen."
Mhm.
And I was aware of this situation where the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates were presenting themselves as a unified coalition, but at least a year ago, and probably before that, there were signs that they had different goals and that they were also, if not outright fighting each other, their proxies were, and there was some serious trouble.
Mhm.
And you take this point further, and I think that you framed it in a good way, is that, look, this coalition and their stated goals of restoring the Hadi president back to power doesn't even make sense now, because the Saudis and the UAE don't even have the same goals. And I mean, I'm not at all ignoring the obvious reasons why the United States should not be supporting and participating in this coalition. But now it's like glaringly obvious, although most people probably don't know what you have laid out there. But now the stated goals are just out the window. So if you can, I don't think I did even half justice to that. So if you could sort of explain to the audience the points that you were making there. And by the way, thank you for that. In order to explain this situation, Shireen also did like a concise history of what has gone on in this country over the last century, and in more recent days. And I thought that was excellent, by the way. I appreciated that.
Thank you. It's always difficult to write pieces like this because, as somebody who was born and raised in South Yemen, back when Yemen was two countries, it's part of my understanding of, I have that framework to work with, but often people don't really realize that Yemen was divided into two countries, or don't really realize the implication of unity and what that did to the country. And so I felt it important to lay out some background, but it's also very difficult to do that.
Yeah, to summarize it in the amount of space that you used, I thought it was really exceptional, to be honest. Yeah.
Thank you. So the Yemen, the North-South divide, essentially, which was there for a very long time as a result of various colonialists, ended with a unity in 1990, which then fell apart in 1994. And many people in South Yemen continued in the former South Yemen with its capital Aden, continued to feel that they were under some kind of forced unity, that they didn't really sign on to this. Of course, it was in the end an error of leaders who rushed into this and didn't really think about the repercussions for the people. They didn't have enough of a transition time, and by then Yemenis were very different and they had very different histories. So the civil war broke out in '94, and since then there were groups in the south who continued to call for secession, and eventually in 2017, so just a couple of years ago, a group called the Southern Transitional Council was formed. And the fact that they were even allowed to be formed was a problem for the Hadi government, because the Hadi government is almost entirely based in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia pays Hadi's paycheck and his government's paychecks. But then the UAE began to support the separatist movement, the Southern Transitional Council, the STC, who were kind of the de facto government in Aden, but without posing direct challenges to the Hadi government. Why they
It's hard. I wonder how they did that because, yeah, anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt
Well,
you.
they have a lot of support from people in Aden, especially. A lot of people in Aden want separation from the north, and so they didn't see a point in continuing to support Hadi, who is representing unity, essentially. He was Saleh's vice president for 20 odd years, and so and the fact that the coalition continues to fight the Houthis, who are mostly in former North Yemen, makes no sense to a lot of Southerners who say, well, we already have, the coalition is in control of the former South. What do you need with North Yemen? Why do you continue waging this war? Why can't we just have our own country again? And so the STC was allowed to kind of operate, very surprisingly. I mean, but then again, Hadi doesn't really have a say in any of this. This is foreign governments, doing as they please. And in the summer, when the UAE started giving out hints that they were thinking about pulling back, really they weren't pulling back in Yemen. They were just training more Yemeni mercenaries and moving some of their security forces out. That's when the STC essentially took Aden by force. And there were reports that the UAE was bombing Hadi-backed forces. And so in the end, they're going to do what's best for them, and they will support whatever party and whoever leader is going to serve their interests. Hadi has just been an excuse, but they were also willing to make deals with Saleh back in 2017, at the end of 2017. That ended very poorly, very badly with, Saleh's death at the hands of the Houthis, but they were even willing to, show support to him after he had been fighting them. So the coalition is just looking for anyone who would serve their interest and help them, quote unquote, win this war. Whereas, Hadi is just kind of used as an excuse.
Yeah. But Hadi is originally a leader from South Yemen, right?
So he's from South Yemen, but he lived in North Yemen for many years while Yemen was still divided into North and South, and then ended up being the general who was in charge of leading the Northern Army into retaking Aden when the South called for secession back in 1994. So he was serving the interests of the Northerners essentially, and I don't think he doesn't. The one thing Yemenis seem to be united on, whether North or South, is that nobody really likes Hadi. He can't stay longer than a day or a week in the country, and even then he has to stay offshore because his life would be in danger.
Yeah, so he doesn't seem to have much loyalty to South Yemen or South Yemen as a separate entity now.
Not at all.
Right. And then when I became aware of this situation was when the United Arab Emirates took that. Oh, now I'm going to forget the name of that island, that amazing island.
Socotra?
Yeah, Socotra. And I talked to Issa Bloomy about it, and he explained how the cracks in that coalition were beginning to show. And so at this point, and I guess they're obviously still there, they've only gotten worse. Mm-hmm. So does it look like the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates does it look like the Emiratis want to split the country again and keep South Yemen, or are there certain particular assets they're looking for? Like, do we understand their motivations in this at all, or?
There's it's interesting when you try to break apart the interests of the different coalition members. I think initially the UAE just got into the war because Saudi was interested in bombing and kind of reasserting control over Yemen, which they've always had. They've always had some control over Yemen, and they weren't willing to lose that control with the election or with the coup or the takeover of Sana'a by the Houthis. Um, the UAE, I think, just kind of got involved at the beginning, but then started to carve out a more substantial role. So it seems that they're more interested in the islands, which would be a major source of revenue for them for tourism, given how, especially the island of Socotra is just an incredibly beautiful, one of a kind, biodiverse island. And they also seem to be interested in the gas liquefaction plants and the ports and the oil reserves in northern Yemen, which is why they didn't just go with separation entirely, separating north from south. There are areas in northern Yemen of Ma'rib, which is still a battlefront, and Al Jof province, which has a lot of gas and oil reserves. So that's why they've been pushing to assert dominance over the rest of Yemen, even though they're still supporting a southern secessionist movement. And then, of course, they're acting like the police, the secret police, because they have all of these secret prisons in South Yemen, which are rampant with torture and sexual torture and whatnot. So it seems like the UAE has more of an imperialistic goal in Yemen, whereas the Saudis just kind of want to bomb and win, which hasn't worked out very well for either of them. But I think that the UAE has been much more nefarious and much more destructive. But of course, they don't get as much attention in this as the Saudis do.
Yeah, it's quite interesting how quietly they've done this. I mean, the port of Aden is an immensely valuable and
Right.
strategic port, and I didn't even know about those islands until last year. And the looks like the Red Sea corridor there is going to become more and more important. And yeah, it's hard to keep track of all of these things, even a basic understanding of it. But the Emiratis are a very curious group of people in general.
Mm.
They hard to understand in my view.
Yeah.
But so let's move on then to. I know that this is sort of a segue, but I really wanted to talk about the opinion piece that you wrote. For people who don't know, Samantha Power, that's from the Obama administration. She was first on the National Security Council, a key advisor of President Obama, and then she moved on to become the UN ambassador for, I think, the last 4 years of his term. She just put out a memoir. I didn't read it. Kudos to you. I wouldn't have been able to get through it because I'm not happy with her. So the most amazing thing about it, in my view, from what I've read of what I've heard about it and what you've written about it, is that she doesn't even mention her role in the war in Yemen. Does she mention the war in Yemen at all?
Not at all.
I
Not a
can't
single
even
reference
believe
to.
that.
Yep, there's been not a single reference to the war at all. Yemen shows up twice in her book, and both times it has nothing to do with the war. In one instance, she just kind of mentions it as one of the countries who has on the books, capital punishment for people who are gay. And in another, she just kind of mentions it in passing as she's telling another story, but nothing related to the war in Yemen at all. It's as though it never happened under her watch.
She's doing the podcast round. I'm sure she's doing cable TV and other things too and radio, but I noticed she's been on several very now prominent podcasts from the foreign policy establishment and the cool kids, if you will, not in my view, but
Mm-hmm.
they like to think of themselves that way. And I wonder if anyone is going to confront her. I wonder. I wonder if she sets out terms ahead of time, not to bring it up. But she does bring up the war in Libya, the Libyan intervention, but she plays down her role in that, you said?
Yeah, I mean, she just kind of downplays the bloodshed that followed. That it wasn't, anything serious. There's no mention of the open market the open, slave markets that ended up happening in Libya and the entire destruction of that country as a result of the intervention. She also mentioned Syria, which she was instrumental in getting the Obama administration to intervene. And her focus there is that she's kind of upset that they didn't intervene sooner in Syria.
Yeah, I know that point of view. That's like the McCain point of view, which is, I don't agree with that at all. So, and let's just go over real quick what role she did play in this, because interestingly, as soon as he was out of office and she was no longer in that position, she started tweeting about, how the war was wrong. I know I responded to that immediately. Um, and I know a lot of other people called her out on it. So it's not like she doesn't know
Right.
that people are
See the
aware.
contradiction, yeah.
Yeah.
And you know what? It's great if somebody was having kind of a change of heart and a change of mind. That's fine. We want people to evolve and to change and to improve. But to not then, to write an entire memoir and not acknowledge in any way. I mean, she's writing her history in that book, right? And she has the opportunity to craft the narrative that she wants to tell, yet she doesn't, you know, talk about the things that she tweeted about. She says that, she signed letters and she says that these things are wrong, that the Obama administration should have never supported the Saudi-led coalition. But she doesn't do that in her book, in the story that she tells herself and others about herself and about her time at the UN. The support of the war, of the intervention right from the onset of the war, staying silent as the numbers of people who were dead was increasing. It was at least 10,000 people were dead at the time. At least 80% of the population was in need of humanitarian aid. Evidence surfaced at that time that they were working openly with Al-Qaeda. And, the Saudis were getting to basically choose people who would investigate their war crimes in Yemen. And she was part of that process of providing cover for them at the UN to try to strike down various proposals of neutrality and independent investigators, and really allowing the person setting the fire to investigate the arson. So it made she played a substantial role, and then there was no recognition in her book of saying, this is what I've done, this shouldn't have happened. Even one sentence saying that, I regret the involvement of the US in this war. Nothing, not an acknowledgement at all.
Yeah, I remember when I saw the title of it, it's The Education of an Idealist. I thought, well, she's going to try to. Well, the first thing I thought, to be honest, was that it was going to be her try to, clean up her reputation a bit, and also just kind of set the stage, almost like a job application for
Right.
Secretary of State, which is, I think, what she wants from, or some definitely high level
Right.
position. And I thought, all right, well, you're right. I mean, that's good insight. It was the perfect platform for her to, admit, what she's learned or maybe what she would do
Right.
differently and things like that. But clearly, instead, she's going more for a Madeleine Albright type set.
Right. Right.
Her target is not the more anti-interventionist, people rethinking our whole role and empire and such.
Hmm.
She's not aiming for that audience at all, is she?
No, no, not at all. I mean, it sounds like she's like, this is a job application for the Biden administration, if I
Yeah,
had to guess. There's no recognition that this was wrong, that we should rethink this. There's just, no acknowledgement of Yemen as though it never happened. And I think it basically sends the message that she'll continue doing this. And she continues to think of herself as an activist, which makes no sense to me. There's no humanitarian reason any of these interventions should have happened. Um, and in the case of Yemen, she doesn't reflect on it at all. So we don't know what she was thinking at the time, but um, you know, there was no case to be made at the time that Yemen was going through any kind of humanitarian condition that needed the support of the United States. It wasn't that way at all. So the story that she's crafted is basically, one that is self-congratulatory, I think.
well, I can just hope that in one of these interviews, someone holds her accountable a little bit. I know that I've seen protesters at one particular event. She was on stage, and a protester made a very valid point, and I believe she just basically said, well, that was Obama's, that wasn't my decision, that was Obama's, and the other person was hauled out of the room, and yeah, it didn't go well.
Right.
But hopefully somebody will call her on it in one of these interviews. We can hope. So one other thing I saw was on your Twitter feed, and it's from September 29th, and there's a group of Congress folk. You say, I guess it's
Oh, yes.
yeah, you say well, somebody, I think, quote tweeted you, because there's a CNN tweet that said these 5 freshman congresswomen changed history by becoming unlikely leaders on impeachment. And
Right.
then I think you quote tweeted that, and you said, if they cared about upholding the Constitution, they would have voted to end Trump's unconstitutional war in Yemen. Instead, Representative Sherrill, Representative Houlihan, Representative Slotkin, and Representative Spanberger were part of the Famine Five, hashtag Famine Five, who voted for the war. And someone else joined in with you there and noted that some of them were former intelligence. There was a whole big group of former intelligence people who ran for Congress in 2018. But anyway, tell us a little bit more about this group of people.
Right. So back in July, I believe, there was a vote in the House regarding amendments that were supposed to limit U.S. participation in the war in Yemen, that would not direct the intelligence sharing, and this is related to the National Defense Authorization Act, so that there were some amendments that were supposed to be in place to protect Yemeni civilians from U.S. weapons, since they seem to be causing the most damage currently. And over the last 4.5 years. And every Democrat voted in favor of those amendments, except for these 5 Democrats. And I think many of them were ex-military, ex-CIA. So there were these 4 representatives that you read out, as well as Representative Jason Crow. And so I remembered this particularly because Representative Slotkin is my rep. She's my rep here in Lansing, Michigan. And of course, it was a very disappointing vote. And, this war is unconstitutional. Congress has already agreed that this war is unconstitutional, yet to continue to provide support for the Trump administration to allow them to continue supporting the Saudi-led coalition in this way is then in a direct violation of the Constitution that these people supposedly promised to uphold or swore to uphold. And so then when the CNN story came out over the weekend of these, quote unquote badasses who were all women, freshmen or junior congresswomen, and had kind of banded together to be, quote, unlikely leaders on impeachment, a lot of people were upset by that characterization because, they're erasing the roles of many congresswomen of color who have been leading the fight against impeachment for a very long time. But what stood out to me was Slotkin. So Representative Slotkin, I was like, oh, she's my rep who really does not care about the Constitution. If she would have voted for this, against this, for this amendment back in July. But then when I noticed that it wasn't just her, 4 out of these 5 women were also part of that Famine Five, I thought I should tweet out this one, just note that these were contradictory values.
Yeah, I was really glad to see that. I wouldn't have put that together if you hadn't done that. And personally, I don't know if it's the wrong word to say I'm offended, but I'm bothered when women are put forward as, furthering the wars, selling the wars and things like that. It seems to be a really popular thing to do now, is to use female spokespeople almost for the interventions, and it bothers me a lot.
Right, because this doesn't move feminism forward. I mean, it doesn't,
No.
we don't need equality with males on how many people we get to bomb. We need to stop bombing people altogether.
And who suffers I mean, everyone suffers in a war, but
Right.
generally, who are the the biggest victims are generally women and children.
Right, right.
So, it's just mind-boggling to me. It really is, and offensive in my view. So, to wrap it up, Shireen, so given the situation in Yemen, it's complicated, it's poorly understood, though you're doing a great job of helping boil it down and helping people understand it, and tireless activism. But is there anything else that you'd like to offer, to the audience in the way of either like clarification or advice on what to focus on to help stop this war, or in some way make the situation better? Because if there's one thing I do know about the situation in Yemen, it's that I think every person listening to this, wants these atrocities to end and is frustrated by the fact that we're still there and that we're still a key player and that we could end this today if our leadership wanted to, but they haven't. So I'll just open this up to you for the last minute or so, and to use it however you like.
That's exactly right. We can't really control what's happening in Yemen. So even if people are unhappy with the Houthis or with various groups in Yemen, I think what's really important to understand is that we can't control, and we should not be controlling what happens in other countries. This country nearly lost its mind with accusations of Russian interference in our elections.
Right.
And here we are, bombing countries for years in order to install the person that we want to install against the will of the people. And so I think it's really important for us to understand that as Americans, as people who live here and who have elected officials, our responsibility is to make sure that our elected officials aren't using this as an opportunity to make money on the backs of innocent civilians in Yemen. Our officials are both Obama and Trump and their administrations have been in violation, knowingly violating the Constitution that we uphold here in order to continue to profit from this war. There is no justification for the U.S.'s involvement in this war. We've helped create the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And if we stop providing weapons and intelligence to the Saudis, then they're really not capable of continuing to wage this war on their own. They're entirely dependent on the U.S.'s support, all the way from training their soldiers, updating their vehicles, to deciding what to target and where to target. And so if the U.S. were to withdraw support, then the hope for many of us is that the Saudi-led coalition would kind of be, helpless in a sense and not know how to continue to wage this war, at least to this scale. And so if people can get behind that, that's all we really need. As complicated as this issue is, that's really what it boils down to, is that we are unjustly bombing people to no end and causing the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And if people want to know how to get involved, a good friend of mine, Jihan Hakim, she started the Yemeni Alliance Committee, and there are different chapters across the country. People can go to facebook.com/YAC of California and learn about ways to get involved and to, currently we have a call to members of Congress to push the National Defense Authorization Act with the amendments that protect Yemeni civilians from U.S. bombs. And so we're hoping that that would go through with the amendments at the very least, but there's always something to do related to legislation and holding our elected officials accountable.
Okay, great. And I'll get that information and link that in the show notes too for everybody. And don't forget that Shireen has given us another strong argument to use in this, the fact that the Saudis and the Emiratis aren't even fighting for the same thing anymore. The coalition goals are all out the window. So that's just another argument for why we need to get out of this.
Right.
And where can everybody find your work, and how can they find you on social media?
So I'm at Shireen818, Shireen 818 on Twitter. And I kind of have dedicated the Twitter page. I mean, I only joined Twitter to learn more about what was happening in Yemen. And I've dedicated that page to informing people about what's going on, keeping them posted on things that they can get involved in. And I write mostly for In These Times magazine. So if you go to inthesetimes.com and look up my profile, they can find the articles that I've been writing.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much. I know that you're in high demand right now, a valuable voice in this situation, and I really appreciate the time.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for focusing on this.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. A special thanks to Shireen Al-Adeimi. Follow Shireen on Twitter at Shireen, Shireen 818, and find her work on the In These Times website. The Around the Empire podcast is independent media. Your support is really important. Pitch in if you can at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or at paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. The audio podcast can be found in many places. You can find it on any mobile podcast app or on the website aroundtheempire.com or on Patreon, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or on YouTube, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. And if you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and leave some comments. Send some feedback. Also follow on Twitter at Around the Empire, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.